appropriate. It says this in the rules, under the frequently asked questions page, word for word. Submissions are supposed to be creepy stories to spread around the internet for a bit of an adrenaline rush on those late nights alone. They're not real. They're not meant to be full of explicit gore or violence. They've always been simple stories. Sometimes overdone, sometimes with plenty of cliches or plot holes, but never truly chilling to the bone. Not before that night. As most of you probably know, creepypasta.org receives plenty of submissions. I had started reading over submissions, deciding to help out after becoming a member. It was much harder than I expected, to be honest. Most of the submissions I turned down didn't cross my mind even once after they had been rejected. Most violators followed a similar pattern. Blatant creepypastas, grammatical errors, far too frequent to ignore, rewrites of previous pastas that had been done time and time again. Now, I'm quite the horror fanatic. I love movies, games, stories, anything with a macabre theme that would send chills down the spine. Unfortunately, being such a frequenter of these sites and sources resulted in a sort of immunity to the creepy. Reading through submissions never really made me glance over my shoulder or peer into dark crevices. Not like it used to, anyway. I got cocky and thought that nothing could scare me. That I was invincible to the supposed creep factor. I was stupid. It was late one night, and my roommate was exhausted after studying for some class, so she had turned in for the night. My cat had been fed and was lounging in the other room, probably dozing off for the moment. Millie only ever got up to run around after I'd gone to bed. Finding that the most inconvenient time for me must have been the most fun for her. With no homework on my agenda and no work the next day, I tried to filter through as many of the submissions as I could, hoping for something new and exciting. Eventually, I got through rather quickly, rating each one and moving on. Shock factor was next on my list. A submission from a user named Submission Filler. I wouldn't be contacting whoever this was. This seemed like a one-time thing. Regardless, I started reading through almost bored at first, as they seemed to go with the cliche setting of being alone on a dark, stormy night. Nothing stood out, at least not at first, but then I kept reading. Maybe they'd surprise me, I thought. God, I wish I hadn't. As I kept reading, the story warped into some twisted torture flick. Apparently, the protagonist wasn't completely alone. He had someone tied down in the other room. Their narration quickly slipped into a step-by-step account of a horrific dissection without any anesthesia on some complete stranger. The part that sent a shiver up my spine was the descriptiveness. It was so detailed, so involved. It was like nothing I had ever read before, blunt and all too natural. I rejected it, of course. It violated the rules, and the username looked fake. I simply discarded it with the others and moved on. It stuck, of course. It had disturbed me a great deal, but I brushed this off just as being a good narrative. If that submission had fallen within the rules, it might have made a good addition. A couple of days went by, and at first I had forgotten all about shock factor. Eventually, I decided to look through submissions again. And again I went through the stories and rejected whatever didn't follow the frequently asked questions page. Honestly, you'd think some of these people hadn't even given the link a quick gloss over. And it showed up again. Shock Factor, Part 2. Did this person honestly expect a Part 2 to be submitted when his first had been rejected? I felt kind of pissed off, thinking that this person had just resubmitted their works, and even a little bit nervous as I remembered just how graphic the last one had been. Regardless, I opened the submission and started to skim through. I was disgusted as I found that the narrator was up to his old tricks, this time with a younger victim, stated as being somewhere around 15 years old. I didn't bother reading through the whole thing, as it somehow managed to disturb me more than the last one. Detailed accounts of torture and abuse far beyond what I ever wanted to read in my life. All the while, it had an extremely real feel to it. That tone that dragged me in and made me believe that this was some actual legitimate account for a brief moment rather than some sicko's idea of a joke. A sick joke to play on the staff while rejecting his first story. That's what this must have been. It was discarded, and I didn't volunteer to help anymore after that. For a short while, I thought it was over, and I went back to my normal everyday life. Classes, work, boyfriend, classes, work, boyfriend, classes, yada yada yada. And I began to slip back into my schedule. Though memories of Shock Factor kept bubbling up over the next week or so. I assured myself that it was over until I received an email titled Shock Factor Part 3 to my personal address. It was impossible. There was no way this guy could have gotten my personal email. I was unnerved, to say the least, by the fact that he found me. I tried to think of every possible logical explanation, even getting upset as I considered that my roommate had planned some elaborate prank to disprove my boasting over never being creeped out. After sending her an annoyed text, I received a new one. This time titled Shock Factor Part 3. You should read it this time. My blood ran cold. I looked at the description nervously and glimpsed of the message any Gmail user would be familiar with seeing located next to the title. This time, there's a cat. And I know you love your... It read, trailing off. I exited the tab and closed my computer. On some sort of god-awful suspicion, I suddenly stood up and began searching the apartment for Millie. I called for her. looked under the furniture. I even asked my roommate about her, and for nowhere. I started to panic, convincing myself that whoever this anonymous sender was, they had somehow managed to get their hands on something close to me. My pet, out of my house, is the topic of one of his twisted stories. How else could he have known I had a cat? How could he have known my email address? Who the hell was he? Months went by. I graduated and moved on in life and got a job. I never did find Millie. I never did find out who was emailing me. My old roommate assures me that she knew nothing about it. Occasionally, I'll still get these strange emails, even after changing over to new addresses, new additions to the Shock Factor series. Every time with a short description. The worst part is that every time I receive a submission, it seems to happen after I lose something. And whatever I lose ends up in the story. I'll misplace a sewing kit and find Shock Factor Part 6, Stitching. Or I'll lose a pair of scissors and receive Shock Factor Part 9, Cutting Up. It scares me now. I dread checking my email. I'm paranoid. I never go out alone. It's putting a lot of strain on me and on my boyfriend. I make him go everywhere with me except to work. The Shock Factor series has worked its way up to part 23 at this point. I don't know how much more I can take. If you ever see a submission from Submission Filler, an email titled Shock Factor, or from the address submission.spacefiller, anything of the sort, please ignore it. For your own sake, ignore it. I don't know if that would even work, but it's driving me crazy. I can't go anywhere alone, and I feel like someone is following me. Like the stranger knows everything that goes on in my life. I don't know how his stories got so realistic either, but I don't want to think about it. I just got a text the other day too. One that has driven me to the point of seeking legal help. I'm going to the police now. He has my phone number, and he's not going to stay out of sight forever. Part 30 will feature a guest star. I'm afraid I'll have to move on to finding a new editor after she has her episode though. How unfortunate. I knew her so well.